The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Millbrook, a once thriving suburban town now reduced to a graveyard of overturned cars and shattered windows. Marcus Thompson crouched behind a rusted pickup truck, his weathered hands gripping a modified crossbow as he surveyed the eerily quiet neighborhood. 3 months had passed since the outbreak began, and the former construction foreman had learned that silence in this new world was often more terrifying than the groans of the undead. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp autumn air as he counted the shambling figures in the distance, 7 zombies wandering aimlessly through what used to be Maple Street, their torn clothing and vacant stares serving as grim reminders of the humanity they had lost. Behind him, tucked away in the basement of an old hardware store, 23 survivors had gathered to form what they called the Millbrook Defense Coalition. It wasn't an official name, just something that Rebecca Martinez, a former Army medic, had suggested during one of their planning meetings. The group consisted of people from all walks of life who had somehow managed to avoid infection during the initial chaos. There was David Kim, a high school science teacher who had become their unofficial strategist, and Jennifer Walsh, a local police officer who served as their weapons instructor. Tommy Rodriguez, barely 18 and fresh out of high school, had proven surprisingly adept at scavenging supplies, while elderly Frank Morrison, despite his 72 years, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the town's layout that had saved their lives more times than anyone could count. Marcus adjusted his position slightly, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. As the group's elected leader, he had to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for everyone under his protection. The hardware store had served them well as a temporary base, with its concrete walls and limited entry points, but their supplies were running dangerously low. The last successful scavenging run had been 4 days ago, and their food reserves would last maybe another week if they continued rationing strictly. Water wasn't an immediate concern thanks to the store's old well, but ammunition was becoming scarce, and winter was approaching fast. The sound of footsteps on gravel made Marcus tense, but he relaxed when he recognized the careful, measured pace of Rebecca approaching from behind. She moved with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned that survival depended on never making unnecessary noise. Her medical bag was slung across her shoulder, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it out of her face during their dangerous excursions. She had been checking on their injured members, particularly old Mrs. Patterson, who had twisted her ankle during their last supply run and was still recovering. "The zombies are moving in a pattern," Marcus whispered as Rebecca settled beside him, her keen eyes immediately focusing on the undead figures in the distance. David was right about them following some kind of routine. "They've been walking the same route for the past 2 hours." Rebecca nodded, pulling out a small notebook where she had been documenting their observations about zombie behavior. It was one of many survival tactics they had developed through trial and error, learning that knowledge about their enemy was just as valuable as weapons or food. The two of them watched as the zombies continued their mindless patrol, occasionally bumping into each other or getting momentarily distracted by a piece of debris blowing in the wind. Marcus had noticed that these particular zombies seemed to be drawn to the area around the old shopping center, possibly because that's where they had been when the infection took hold. It was a theory that David had proposed, suggesting that zombies retained some subconscious memory of their final human activities. Whether or not it was true, the pattern gave the survivors a tactical advantage they desperately needed. "Jennifer wants to try the flanking maneuver we discussed," Rebecca said quietly, referring to their plan to approach the shopping center from the east while a smaller team created a distraction from the west. The shopping center still contained valuable supplies, including a pharmacy that could provide much-needed medical equipment and medications. However, it was also crawling with zombies, making any attempt to reach it extremely dangerous. They had been planning this operation for weeks, waiting for the right moment when the zombie population in the area was at its lowest. Marcus considered the proposal carefully, weighing the risks against their desperate need for supplies. The flanking maneuver was sound in theory, but it required precise timing and coordination. One mistake could lead to the entire group being overwhelmed by the undead. He thought about the faces of the people depending on him, young Tommy, who still had nightmares about losing his family in the first week of the outbreak, and Mrs. Patterson, who reminded him of his own grandmother. There was also little Emma Collins, only 8 years old, who had somehow survived on her own for 2 weeks before they found her hiding in a school cafeteria. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did in moments like these. Before the outbreak, Marcus had been responsible for construction crews and building projects. Now he was responsible for human lives in a world where death lurked around every corner. He had seen too many good people fall to the zombies, and each loss felt like a personal failure. But he had also seen the incredible resilience of the human spirit, the way ordinary people could adapt and overcome seemingly impossible odds when they worked together. A distant moan carried on the wind, causing both Marcus and Rebecca to freeze. It was coming from the north, beyond their line of sight, and it sounded different from the usual zombie vocalizations they had grown accustomed to. This moan had an almost musical quality to it, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. In their 3 months of survival, they had learned that zombies were constantly evolving, developing new behaviors that made them increasingly dangerous. "We need to get back to the others," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. Rebecca nodded in agreement, and they began their careful retreat toward the hardware store. As they moved, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was about to change in their ongoing battle for survival. The zombies were adapting, and if the survivors wanted to continue living, they would need to adapt even faster. The real test of their survival tactics was about to begin, and Marcus only hoped that their months of preparation would be enough to see them through whatever new horror was approaching from the north. The basement of the hardware store buzzed with tense whispers as Marcus and Rebecca descended the creaking wooden stairs, their faces grim with the weight of what they had witnessed. The underground space had been transformed into a makeshift command center, with salvaged furniture arranged in a rough circle around a large table covered in hand-drawn maps of the surrounding area. Battery-powered lanterns cast dancing shadows on the concrete walls, creating an atmosphere that was both secure and claustrophobic. The 21 survivors who weren't on watch duty looked up expectantly as their leaders entered, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and fear that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. David Kim stood near the largest map, a detailed sketch of Millbrook that he had been updating with zombie movement patterns and potential resource locations. His methodical approach to survival had earned him the respect of the group, and his teaching background made him naturally suited to explaining complex strategies to people with varying levels of tactical experience. Beside him, Jennifer Walsh was cleaning her service weapon with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that a malfunctioning firearm could mean death in their current reality. Her police training had been invaluable in teaching the others basic combat techniques and weapon safety, though she often reminded them that their goal should always be avoidance rather than confrontation. "We have a problem," Marcus announced, his voice cutting through the quiet conversations. The room fell silent immediately, with even young Emma Collins looking up from the coloring book that Tommy Rodriguez had found for her during their last supply run. The 8-year-old had shown remarkable resilience in adapting to their harsh new reality, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes whenever discussions turned to the dangers lurking outside their sanctuary. Mrs. Patterson, despite her injured ankle, leaned forward from her makeshift bed, her weathered face creased with concern. Rebecca moved to the map table and pointed to an area north of their current position. "We heard something different out there today. The zombies are making new sounds, almost like they're communicating with each other." Her words sent a ripple of unease through the group, as everyone understood the implications of what she was suggesting. Since the outbreak began, zombies had been largely predictable in their behavior, slow-moving, attracted to noise and movement, but essentially mindless. The possibility that they were developing more sophisticated behaviors was terrifying to contemplate. Frank Morrison, the elderly man whose knowledge of Millbrook's geography had saved them countless times, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I've lived in this town for 43 years, he said, his voice carrying the authority of experience. I know every street, every building, every hiding place. But if those things are getting smarter, all that knowledge might not be enough anymore. His words hung heavy in the air, as everyone grappled with the reality that their carefully developed survival strategies might need to be completely reconsidered. Tommy Rodriguez, despite his youth, had proven to be one of their most valuable scouts due to his agility and intimate knowledge of the town's youth hangouts and hidden passages. He raised his hand tentatively, drawing attention from the adults who had learned to value his insights. "I've noticed something too," he said, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "When I was checking the perimeter yesterday, I saw a group of zombies near the old movie theater. They weren't just wandering around randomly like usual. They were standing in formation, almost like they were waiting for something." Jennifer Walsh looked up from her weapon maintenance, her expression serious. "Formation suggests organization, and organization suggests intelligence. If the zombies are developing tactical awareness, we're facing a completely different kind of threat." She had seen enough combat situations to understand that an organized enemy was exponentially more dangerous than a chaotic one, regardless of their individual capabilities. The implications for their small group of survivors were sobering to consider. David Kim began sketching notes on a separate piece of paper, his analytical mind already working to process this new information. "We need to establish observation protocols," he said, falling back on his teaching instincts to break down complex problems into manageable components. "If the zombies are changing, we need to document those changes and adapt our strategies accordingly. Knowledge is our greatest weapon in this situation." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person to ensure they understood the gravity of their circumstances. The discussion was interrupted by a soft knocking sound coming from the ceiling above them, 3 quick taps, followed by 2 longer ones. It was the signal from their lookouts that something was approaching the building. Everyone in the basement froze, hands instinctively moving to weapons or preparing to move to predetermined positions. Marcus held up his hand for silence, straining to hear any additional signals from above. The knocking pattern repeated, but this time it was followed by a single long tap, indicating that whatever was approaching wasn't immediately threatening. Rebecca moved quietly to the base of the stairs, ready to relay messages between the basement and the lookouts above. The communication system they had developed was crude but effective, allowing them to coordinate without using radios that might attract unwanted attention. After several tense minutes, the all-clear signal came down, 5 quick taps that meant the immediate danger had passed. However, the interruption served as a stark reminder of how precarious their situation had become. "We can't stay here much longer," Marcus said, voicing what everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to acknowledge. The hardware store had served them well, but it was becoming increasingly clear that their current location was too exposed and too well known to the zombie population. They needed to find a more defensible position, preferably one that would allow them to observe and study the changing behavior patterns of their undead enemies without putting themselves at unnecessary risk. Jennifer Walsh holstered her weapon and moved to join the discussion around the map table. "I've been thinking about the old fire station on the edge of town," she said, pointing to a location that was marked on David's hand-drawn map. "It's built like a fortress, with thick walls and multiple exit routes. Plus, it has a radio tower that might still be functional." The suggestion sparked immediate interest, as everyone recognized the potential advantages of such a location. However, reaching the fire station would require crossing several miles of zombie-infested territory, a journey that would test all of their survival skills and tactical knowledge. As the group began discussing the logistics of such a move, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The zombies were evolving, becoming more dangerous with each passing day, and their small band of survivors would need to evolve even faster if they hoped to stay alive. The real question was whether they could adapt quickly enough to stay ahead of an enemy that seemed to be learning from every encounter. Dawn broke gray and overcast as Marcus led a carefully selected reconnaissance team through the abandoned streets toward the old fire station. The team consisted of himself, Rebecca, Jennifer, and Tommy, a combination of experience and agility that represented their best chance of gathering intelligence without casualties. They moved in a diamond formation that Jennifer had taught them, maintaining visual contact while covering different angles of approach. The morning air carried an unnatural stillness that made every footstep seem amplified, and the absence of normal city sounds created an atmosphere of oppressive tension that weighed heavily on each team member. The route to the fire station took them through the industrial district, where abandoned factories and warehouses provided both cover and potential hiding spots for zombies. Marcus had chosen this path specifically because the large buildings would allow them to observe zombie behavior from elevated positions while minimizing their exposure to detection. As they approached the first warehouse, Tommy signaled that he had spotted movement near the loading docks. The team immediately took cover behind a row of shipping containers, their hearts racing as they prepared to assess the threat level. What they saw through the gaps between containers defied everything they thought they knew about zombie behavior. A group of 15 zombies was arranged in 3 distinct rows, standing motionless in what could only be described as military formation. At the front of the group stood a zombie that appeared different from the others. Its movements were more deliberate, its posture more erect, and most disturbing of all, it seemed to be directing the others through a series of guttural sounds and gestures. The team watched in horrified fascination as this apparent leader zombie pointed toward different areas of the warehouse complex, and the other zombies responded by moving in coordinated groups to those locations. Rebecca gripped Marcus's arm tightly, her medical training allowing her to observe details that the others might miss. "Look at their eyes," she whispered, barely audible even to her companions. "They're not vacant anymore. There's something behind them, some kind of awareness that wasn't there before." The observation sent chills through the entire team, as they realized they were witnessing an evolutionary leap that could fundamentally change the nature of their survival struggle. The zombies weren't just becoming organized, they were developing genuine intelligence. Jennifer Walsh, drawing on her law enforcement experience, began mentally cataloging tactical implications of what they were observing. The coordinated movement pattern suggested that the zombies were capable of planning and executing complex strategies, which meant that traditional evasion techniques might no longer be effective. If the undead could anticipate human behavior and coordinate their responses accordingly, the survivors would need to completely rethink their approach to avoiding detection and confrontation. The stakes of their mission had just increased exponentially. Tommy Rodriguez, despite his youth, possessed an intuitive understanding of urban environments that made him particularly valuable in reconnaissance situations. He noticed that the zombie formation was positioned to control access to multiple exit routes from the warehouse complex, suggesting a level of strategic thinking that was deeply unsettling. "They're not just standing there randomly," he observed quietly. "They're controlling territory, like they understand the concept of tactical positioning." His insight highlighted the terrifying possibility that the zombies were developing military-style organizational capabilities. The team spent nearly an hour observing the zombie formation, documenting their behavior patterns and trying to understand the apparent hierarchy that had emerged within the group. The leader zombie continued to direct the others through a combination of sounds and gestures, and the subordinate zombies responded with what appeared to be understanding and compliance. Most disturbing of all, the zombies seemed to be conducting some kind of patrol pattern, systematically searching the warehouse complex as if they were looking for something specific. As they prepared to continue toward the fire station, Marcus noticed movement on the roof of a nearby building. Using a pair of binoculars that David had salvaged from a sporting goods store, he focused on the distant figures and felt his blood run cold. 3 zombies were positioned on the rooftop, and they appeared to be acting as sentries, scanning the surrounding area with the kind of methodical attention that suggested genuine surveillance capability. The implications were staggering. If zombies were posting lookouts, it meant they understood the concept of perimeter security and were actively working to prevent surprise attacks. The discovery forced the team to completely alter their approach to reaching the fire station. The direct route they had planned would take them through areas that were clearly under zombie surveillance, and the risk of detection had become unacceptably high. Jennifer suggested a longer route that would take them through residential neighborhoods where the zombie presence might be less organized, but even that option carried significant risks given what they had learned about the evolving nature of their enemies. Rebecca pulled out her notebook and began sketching the zombie formations they had observed, creating a visual record that could be shared with the rest of their group. The documentation process helped her process the shocking reality of what they had witnessed, but it also raised troubling questions about the future of human survival in this new world. If zombies were developing intelligence and organizational capabilities at this rate, how long would it be before they became the dominant species on the planet? As they began their circuitous journey toward the fire station, Marcus found himself grappling with the weight of leadership in an increasingly impossible situation. The survival tactics that had kept his group alive for 3 months were based on assumptions about zombie behavior that were no longer valid. They would need to develop entirely new strategies, and they would need to do it quickly before the zombies evolved beyond their ability to counter. The race between human adaptation and zombie evolution had entered a new and terrifying phase. The team moved carefully through abandoned residential streets, using gardens and backyard fences to maintain cover while making progress toward their destination. Every shadow could conceal a zombie sentry, and every sound could trigger an organized response from an intelligent enemy. The simple reconnaissance mission had become a journey into a nightmare where the rules of survival were being rewritten with each passing hour, and the margin for error was shrinking toward zero. The fire station loomed before them like a fortress from another era, its red brick walls and reinforced steel doors offering the promise of security in a world where safety had become a precious commodity. Marcus and his reconnaissance team had spent 4 grueling hours navigating through zombie-controlled territory, using every stealth technique they had learned to avoid the increasingly sophisticated patrols that seemed to be everywhere. The building sat on a slight hill overlooking the town, its radio tower stretching toward the cloudy sky like a beacon of hope for survivors who desperately needed to establish communication with other groups. Jennifer Walsh approached the perimeter fence with the practiced caution of someone who understood that appearances could be deceiving in their current reality. The fire station appeared abandoned, with no visible signs of zombie presence, but their recent discoveries had taught them that the undead were becoming masters of concealment and strategic positioning. She signaled for the others to maintain their positions while she conducted a preliminary sweep of the immediate area, her service weapon drawn and ready as she moved with the fluid grace of someone whose life depended on perfect execution of tactical procedures. Tommy Rodriguez had positioned himself near a cluster of emergency vehicles that were parked outside the station, using their bulk as cover while he observed the surrounding streets for any signs of zombie activity. His young eyes were particularly adept at detecting movement, and his intimate knowledge of the town's layout allowed him to identify potential approach routes that enemies might use to surround their position. The teenager had grown up considerably since the outbreak began, transforming from a carefree high school student into a valuable member of their survival team through necessity and determination. Rebecca Martinez focused her attention on the building itself, using her medical training to assess the structural integrity and defensive capabilities of their potential new home. The fire station had been built to withstand emergencies, with reinforced walls designed to protect valuable equipment and personnel during natural disasters. The multiple bay doors could be secured from the inside, and the second-floor living quarters would provide elevated observation points that could prove invaluable for monitoring zombie movements in the surrounding area. As Jennifer completed her perimeter sweep and signaled the all-clear, Marcus made the decision to approach the main entrance. The heavy steel door was secured with a standard lock that Tommy was able to bypass using skills he had acquired during some questionable teenage adventures that now seemed like valuable survival training. The interior of the fire station was dark and musty, filled with the lingering sense of diesel fuel and cleaning chemicals that spoke to its former purpose as a hub of emergency response activity. The team moved through the building systematically, clearing each room with the methodical precision that had kept them alive through countless dangerous situations. The ground floor contained the main apparatus bay, complete with 2 fire trucks that could potentially be converted into mobile command centers or escape vehicles if the need arose. The equipment storage areas were filled with tools and supplies that could prove invaluable for fortifying their position and maintaining their equipment in the harsh conditions of their new reality. The second floor revealed living quarters that had been designed to house firefighters during extended emergency responses, complete with sleeping areas, a kitchen, and bathroom facilities that could accommodate their entire group with room for expansion. Most importantly, they discovered that the building's water system was still functional, drawing from a deep well that would provide them with a reliable source of clean water independent of municipal systems that had long since failed. Rebecca was particularly excited by the discovery of a well-equipped medical bay that had been maintained for treating injured firefighters and emergency responders. The supplies were far superior to anything they had been able to scavenge from pharmacies and hospitals, including antibiotics and surgical equipment that could mean the difference between life and death for injured survivors. The medical facilities alone made the fire station worth the considerable risks they had taken to reach it. The radio tower proved to be their most significant discovery, as Jennifer's technical knowledge allowed her to determine that the communication equipment was still functional and could potentially reach other survivor groups across a wide geographic area. The possibility of establishing contact with other organized resistance groups offered hope for coordinating larger-scale survival efforts and sharing intelligence about zombie evolution and effective countermeasures. Communication had been one of their greatest weaknesses, and the radio tower could transform them from an isolated group into part of a larger network of survivors. However, their exploration also revealed evidence that they were not the first people to consider the fire station as a potential refuge. Personal belongings scattered throughout the building suggested that other survivors had attempted to establish a base there, but the absence of any human presence raised troubling questions about what had happened to the previous occupants. Marcus found a hastily written note tucked behind a radio console that simply read, "They learned to climb, God help us all," in handwriting that trembled with fear and desperation. The implications of the note sent chills through the entire team, as they realized that the zombie evolution they had been observing was not a recent development but part of an ongoing process that had been claiming survivor groups for weeks or possibly months. The fire station's elevated position and reinforced construction had not been enough to protect its previous occupants from enemies that were becoming increasingly capable of overcoming traditional defensive measures. As they prepared to signal the rest of their group to begin the dangerous journey to their new base, Marcus found himself weighing the benefits of the fire station against the risks of moving their people through zombie-controlled territory. The building offered significant advantages in terms of security, supplies, and communication capabilities, but reaching it would require exposing their entire group to the kind of organized zombie forces they had observed during their reconnaissance mission. The decision would test every aspect of their survival planning and could determine whether their group would thrive in their new location or become another cautionary tale for future survivors to discover. The evacuation of the hardware store began at 3 in the morning, when darkness provided maximum concealment and zombie activity typically reached its lowest ebb. Marcus had spent the previous day developing an intricate movement plan that would transport their 23 survivors across 4 miles of increasingly dangerous territory in 3 separate groups, each taking different routes to minimize the risk of total group loss if they encountered organized zombie resistance. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution, as any deviation could result in groups becoming separated or trapped in hostile territory with no hope of rescue. The first group consisted of their most vulnerable members, including 8-year-old Emma Collins, elderly Mrs. Patterson with her injured ankle, and 3 other survivors who lacked combat experience or physical capabilities necessary for fighting their way out of trouble. Rebecca Martinez led this group along the safest route they had identified, a path that took them through residential backyards and avoided main streets where zombie patrols had been observed. David Kim accompanied them as their navigator, using his detailed knowledge of the town's layout to guide them through a maze of fences, gardens, and abandoned playgrounds. Jennifer Walsh commanded the second group, which included their strongest fighters and most of their weapons and ammunition. This team was tasked with creating diversions if necessary and providing covering fire for the other groups if they encountered trouble during the migration. Tommy Rodriguez served as their scout, using his agility and intimate knowledge of the town's hidden passages to identify potential threats before they could endanger the group. The weight of responsibility for protecting the others had transformed the teenager into a focused and determined young man who understood that lives depended on his ability to detect danger. Marcus led the final group, carrying their most essential supplies and equipment, including the radio components they would need to establish communications from the fire station. His team also included Frank Morrison, whose encyclopedic knowledge of Millbrook's geography had proven invaluable in planning their escape routes and identifying alternative paths if their primary routes became compromised. The elderly man had insisted on making the journey despite his age, arguing that his knowledge was too valuable to risk losing if something happened to the other groups. The first hour of the migration proceeded according to plan, with all three groups making steady progress toward their destination while maintaining radio silence to avoid attracting attention. Rebecca's group successfully navigated through the residential district, using hand signals and predetermined rally points to coordinate their movement through unfamiliar territory. The vulnerable members of their community showed remarkable courage and determination, with even young Emma following instructions perfectly and helping to support Mrs. Patterson when the elderly woman struggled with difficult terrain. However, their carefully laid plans began to unravel when Jennifer's group encountered an unexpected zombie patrol near the old shopping center. The undead were moving in a coordinated formation that blocked their planned route, forcing them to take a longer path that would delay their arrival at the fire station by at least an hour. More troubling was the realization that the zombies seemed to be conducting systematic sweeps of the area, suggesting that they were actively searching for something rather than simply wandering aimlessly through their territory. Tommy Rodriguez observed the zombie patrol from a concealed position and noticed details that sent chills through the entire group. The undead were moving with purpose and coordination that exceeded anything they had previously witnessed, and their leader appeared to be directing them through a complex series of gestures and vocalizations that resembled a primitive but effective communication system. The teenager realized that the zombies were not just patrolling randomly but were conducting an organized search pattern that would eventually cover every possible hiding place in the area. The discovery forced Jennifer to make a critical decision about whether to attempt to bypass the patrol or find an alternative route that would take them far from their intended path. The delay was already putting strain on their carefully coordinated timeline, and any further deviation could result in the groups becoming separated in hostile territory with no way to reunite. She decided to lead her team through a series of abandoned buildings that would allow them to avoid direct confrontation while still making progress toward their destination. Meanwhile, Marcus's group encountered their own challenges when they discovered that several of their planned rally points had been compromised by zombie activity. Frank Morrison's knowledge of the town proved invaluable as he guided them through alternative routes that avoided the main streets where organized zombie patrols had been observed. The elderly man's stamina was beginning to flag under the stress of the long journey, but his determination to reach safety kept him moving despite his obvious exhaustion and the considerable physical demands of navigating through difficult terrain. Rebecca's group was the first to reach the fire station, arriving just as dawn was beginning to break over the horizon. The sight of the fortified building filled them with relief and hope, but their celebration was tempered by the realization that the other two groups were still making their way through zombie-controlled territory. She immediately began preparing the building to receive the other survivors, setting up medical stations and defensive positions while maintaining watch for any signs of pursuit or organized zombie activity in the surrounding area. The radio crackled to life as Jennifer's group reported their position and estimated arrival time, but the transmission was interrupted by sounds of conflict that suggested they had encountered zombie resistance. The brief communication ended abruptly, leaving Rebecca and her team to wonder whether their friends were fighting for their lives or had simply moved beyond radio range. The uncertainty was agonizing, as they realized that their carefully planned migration had become a desperate race against time and an increasingly intelligent enemy. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Marcus's group finally appeared on the horizon, moving quickly but showing signs of exhaustion and stress that indicated they had encountered significant challenges during their journey. Frank Morrison was being supported by two other survivors, his face pale with fatigue but his eyes still alert and determined. The sight of their leader and the elderly man who had become their unofficial historian filled Rebecca's team with relief, but the absence of Jennifer's group continued to weigh heavily on everyone's minds as they prepared to defend their new home against whatever threats might be approaching. The fire station's radio tower crackled with static as Rebecca frantically adjusted the frequency controls, desperately trying to re-establish contact with Jennifer's missing group. 2 hours had passed since their last transmission, and the silence was becoming increasingly ominous as Marcus paced the second-floor command center like a caged animal. Through the reinforced windows, they could see zombie activity increasing throughout the surrounding neighborhoods, with organized patrols moving in patterns that suggested a coordinated search effort was underway. The undead were no longer simply wandering aimlessly but were conducting systematic sweeps that would eventually lead them directly to the fire station. David Kim had transformed the apparatus bay into a makeshift war room, spreading his hand-drawn maps across the hood of one of the fire trucks while plotting zombie movement patterns based on observations from their elevated position. The science teacher's analytical mind was working overtime to identify weaknesses in the enemy's search grid, but the data he was collecting painted an increasingly grim picture of their tactical situation. The zombies were demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that suggested they understood the concept of encirclement and were methodically closing off escape routes from the area. Tommy Rodriguez had volunteered for the dangerous task of maintaining watch from the radio tower, using binoculars to track zombie movements while staying in communication with the command center below. From his elevated position, the teenager could see the full scope of the zombie operation, and what he observed filled him with dread. Multiple groups of undead were converging on their area from different directions, moving with the kind of coordination that indicated central command and control. The zombies had evolved beyond simple pack behavior into something resembling military organization. Mrs. Patterson, despite her injured ankle and advanced age, had taken charge of organizing their supplies and preparing defensive positions throughout the building. Her experience managing a household during the Great Depression had given her valuable skills in resource management and crisis planning that proved invaluable in their current situation. She worked alongside young Emma Collins, who had shown remarkable maturity in helping to prepare ammunition and medical supplies for what was beginning to look like an inevitable siege. The first sign of immediate danger came when Tommy's voice crackled over the radio with urgent intensity. Multiple groups approaching from the north and east, he reported, his young voice steady despite the fear that everyone could hear beneath his words. They're moving in formation, and they've got what looks like a command structure. There's definitely a leader directing the others, and they're positioning themselves to surround the building. The teenagers' observations confirmed their worst fears about the evolving intelligence of their enemies. Marcus made the difficult decision to seal the building's main entrances, using the fire trucks to block the bay doors while teams of survivors worked to reinforce windows and secondary access points. The fire station had been designed to withstand natural disasters, but they were about to test its ability to protect them against an intelligent enemy that was learning to overcome traditional defensive measures. Every person in the building understood that their survival would depend on their ability to hold their position until Jennifer's group could reach them or until they could find another way to escape. Rebecca established a medical station in the central hallway, where she could quickly reach any injured defenders while remaining protected from direct assault. Her supplies from the fire station's medical bay gave her capabilities she had never possessed before, but she also knew that their ammunition was limited and every shot would need to count if they hoped to survive a prolonged siege. The former Army medic began preparing for the worst-case scenario, organizing supplies for treating gunshot wounds and preparing emergency surgical equipment. The attack began with a coordinated assault on multiple entry points, as zombies demonstrated their newfound ability to work together in executing complex tactical maneuvers. The undead used crude tools and debris to attempt to breach the reinforced doors while others climbed onto the roof to search for alternative access routes. The sound of their coordinated assault was unlike anything the survivors had experienced before, with the zombies communicating through a series of grunts and gestures that allowed them to coordinate their efforts with disturbing effectiveness. Frank Morrison, despite his age and physical limitations, proved to be a valuable asset in the defense of their position. His knowledge of the building's layout allowed him to identify potential weak points and suggest defensive improvements that the others might have missed. The elderly man also served as an unofficial historian, documenting their observations about zombie behavior and tactical capabilities for future survivors who might benefit from their hard-won knowledge about the evolving nature of their enemies. As the siege intensified, the defenders realized that the zombies were not simply trying to overwhelm their position through brute force but were conducting a methodical assault designed to probe their defenses and identify weaknesses. The undead would attack one area intensively, then withdraw and shift their focus to another section of the building, learning from each encounter and adapting their tactics accordingly. The level of strategic thinking being demonstrated was far beyond anything they had previously encountered. The radio suddenly burst to life with Jennifer's voice, crackling with static but unmistakably urgent. "Fire station, this is Walsh. We're pinned down 3 blocks south of your position. Heavy zombie presence between us and you. We can see the smoke from your building. Are you under attack?" The transmission filled everyone with relief at knowing their friends were alive, but it also highlighted the desperate nature of their situation as 2 groups of survivors found themselves trapped by an increasingly intelligent enemy. Marcus grabbed the radio microphone, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Jennifer, we're under siege but holding our position. The zombies are more organized than we've ever seen. They're using coordinated tactics and seem to have some kind of command structure. Can you reach the old water tower? We might be able to provide covering fire from there." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass as zombies finally managed to breach one of the first-floor windows, forcing the defenders to shift their attention to the immediate threat of hand-to-hand combat. The battle for the fire station had begun in earnest, and the outcome would determine not only the fate of their small group of survivors but also the future of human resistance against an enemy that was evolving faster than anyone had imagined possible. Every decision made in the next few hours would be critical to their survival, and the margin for error had shrunk to virtually nothing as they faced their most dangerous challenge yet. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the fire station as zombies finally breached the reinforced window on the building's east side, their coordinated assault overwhelming the makeshift barricades that the survivors had constructed. Marcus emptied his crossbow into the first wave of undead attackers, watching with grim satisfaction as his modified bolts found their targets, but for every zombie that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The defenders had prepared for this moment, but the reality of close-quarters combat against intelligent enemies was more terrifying than any of their planning sessions had anticipated. Rebecca Martinez moved with practiced efficiency between defensive positions, treating wounded survivors while coordinating ammunition distribution to ensure that no defender ran out of projectiles at a critical moment. Her medical training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but the systematic nature of the zombie assault was unlike anything she had encountered during her military service. The undead were learning from each failed attack, adapting their tactics in real time and demonstrating a level of battlefield intelligence that challenged every assumption about their capabilities. Tommy Rodriguez had abandoned his position in the radio tower when the zombies began scaling the exterior walls, using climbing techniques that suggested they retained muscle memory from their human lives. The teenager now found himself defending the second-floor stairwell, using his agility and intimate knowledge of the building's layout to create choke points that forced the zombies to attack in smaller groups. His youth and quick reflexes made him particularly effective in the confined spaces where traditional firearms were less useful than improvised weapons and hand-to-hand combat skills. David Kim had transformed the apparatus bay into a fortress within a fortress, using the fire trucks as mobile barriers that could be repositioned to respond to changing tactical situations. His analytical mind was working overtime to identify patterns in the zombie assault, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited to break their coordinated attack. The science teacher had discovered that the zombies seemed to rely heavily on their apparent leader for tactical direction, suggesting that eliminating the command structure might disrupt their entire operation. The breakthrough came when Frank Morrison, observing the battle from his position near the radio equipment, noticed that the zombie leader was directing operations from a position near the old water tower that Jennifer's group was trying to reach. The elderly man's sharp eyes had identified the key to their tactical situation, and he immediately began coordinating with Marcus to develop a plan that could potentially save both groups of survivors. His knowledge of the town's geography would be crucial to executing a counterattack that could turn the tide of the battle. Jennifer Walsh's voice crackled over the radio with increasing urgency as her group found themselves trapped between advancing zombie patrols and the ongoing siege of the fire station. "Marcus, we've got eyes on their command post. There's definitely a leader coordinating this whole operation from the water tower area. If we can take out their command structure, it might disrupt their attack on your position." Her tactical assessment confirmed what the defenders had begun to suspect about the hierarchical nature of the zombie organization. The plan that emerged from their desperate situation was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its requirements for perfect execution. Jennifer's group would conduct a diversionary attack on the zombie command post while the fire station defenders launched a coordinated breakout that would allow them to link up and escape to a predetermined rally point. The success of the operation would depend on precise timing and the hope that eliminating the zombie leadership would cause enough confusion to create an opportunity for escape. Mrs. Patterson, despite her physical limitations, played a crucial role in the plan by coordinating the evacuation of their essential supplies and ensuring that young Emma Collins remained protected during the chaos of the breakout attempt. The elderly woman's organizational skills and calm demeanor under pressure provided stability for the other survivors who were struggling to maintain their composure in the face of an increasingly desperate situation. Her experience surviving previous crises gave her a perspective that helped others focus on what needed to be done rather than dwelling on their fears. The counterstrike began with Tommy Rodriguez leading a small team through the building's maintenance tunnels, using his knowledge of the fire station's infrastructure to emerge behind the zombie assault force. The teenager's mission was to create confusion and draw attention away from the main breakout route while Jennifer's group attacked the command post from their position near the water tower. The coordination required split-second timing and flawless communication between groups that were separated by hundreds of yards of hostile territory. Rebecca Martinez led the medical evacuation team, ensuring that wounded survivors could be moved quickly once the breakout began while maintaining the capability to treat injuries that occurred during the escape attempt. Her dual role as combat medic and tactical coordinator required her to make life-and-death decisions about resource allocation while under fire from enemies that were becoming increasingly aggressive as their organized assault began to falter under the pressure of the coordinated counterattack. The moment of truth arrived when Jennifer's group opened fire on the zombie command post, their concentrated assault creating the chaos and confusion that the fire station defenders needed to launch their breakout. Marcus led the charge through the apparatus bay, using one of the fire trucks as a battering ram to clear a path through the zombie lines while his team provided covering fire for the evacuating survivors. The sound of gunfire and shouting filled the air as two groups of desperate humans fought to reunite and escape from an enemy that had nearly succeeded in destroying them. David Kim's analysis of zombie behavior patterns proved crucial as the breakout unfolded, his predictions about enemy response times allowing the survivors to stay one step ahead of the undead reinforcements that were rushing to contain their escape. The science teacher had identified a critical weakness in the zombie organization. Their reliance on centralized command made them vulnerable to decapitation strikes that could disrupt their entire tactical structure. The success of their counterstrike would depend on whether they could exploit this weakness before the zombies adapted to their new tactics. As the two groups of survivors fought their way toward each other through the chaos of the collapsing zombie siege, Marcus realized that they had learned something crucial about their evolving enemies. The undead were becoming more intelligent and organized, but they were also developing the same vulnerabilities that plagued any hierarchical organization. The key to human survival would be learning to exploit these weaknesses while adapting faster than their enemies could evolve, turning the zombies' growing intelligence into a tactical disadvantage that could be used against them. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook had become an unlikely sanctuary for the reunited survivors, its concrete walls and strategic location providing temporary respite from the chaos they had left behind at the fire station. Marcus stood before the assembled group of 23 people, their faces bearing the marks of exhaustion and trauma but also something that had been absent for too long: hope. The successful counterstrike had proven that humans could adapt and overcome even the most sophisticated zombie tactics, but it had also revealed the true scope of the evolutionary arms race they were engaged in with their undead enemies. Jennifer Walsh was debriefing her team about the assault on the zombie command post, her tactical analysis revealing crucial intelligence about the hierarchical structure that had emerged within the undead population. The zombie leader they had eliminated possessed physical characteristics that set it apart from ordinary zombies: enhanced coordination, improved problem-solving abilities, and most disturbing of all, the capacity to learn from previous encounters and modify tactics accordingly. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the zombie evolution was not random but following a directed path toward greater intelligence and organizational capability. Rebecca Martinez had established a comprehensive medical station in the warehouse's former office space, treating the injuries sustained during their desperate escape while documenting the physiological changes they had observed in the evolved zombies. Her medical expertise allowed her to recognize that the undead were developing enhanced motor functions and sensory capabilities that made them far more dangerous than the shambling corpses they had initially encountered. The evolution was accelerating, and each new generation of zombies seemed to retain more of their human cognitive abilities while gaining new predatory instincts. David Kim had transformed a section of the warehouse into a research center, using salvaged equipment and his scientific background to analyze samples and data they had collected about zombie behavior patterns. His preliminary findings suggested that the undead were developing a form of collective intelligence that allowed them to share information and coordinate activities across large geographic areas. The science teacher's work was providing the theoretical foundation for new survival strategies that could help human communities stay ahead of their rapidly evolving enemies. Tommy Rodriguez had taken on the role of intelligence coordinator, using his network of hiding places and observation posts throughout the town to monitor zombie movements and identify emerging threats before they could endanger the group. The teenager's transformation from carefree student to tactical analyst represented the kind of rapid adaptation that would be necessary for human survival in their changing world. His youth and flexibility made him particularly effective at developing unconventional approaches to problems that traditional thinking could not solve. The warehouse had also become a communication hub, with the radio equipment they had salvaged from the fire station allowing them to establish contact with other survivor groups across the region. The conversations revealed that the zombie evolution was not limited to Millbrook but was occurring simultaneously in communities hundreds of miles apart, suggesting a coordinated transformation that defied conventional understanding of how such changes should occur. The network of survivor communities was sharing intelligence and developing collaborative strategies for dealing with their increasingly sophisticated enemies. Frank Morrison had become their unofficial historian and strategic advisor, his decades of life experience providing valuable perspective on how communities could adapt to existential threats. The elderly man's knowledge of historical survival strategies was being combined with modern tactical thinking to develop new approaches to community defense and resource management. His role as keeper of institutional memory ensured that hard-won lessons would not be lost as the group continued to evolve their survival strategies. Mrs. Patterson had established educational programs for the younger survivors, including Emma Collins, ensuring that essential knowledge and skills would be passed on to the next generation of humans who would inherit this transformed world. Her work with the children was not just about immediate survival but about preserving human culture and values in the face of an existential threat that could fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. The elderly woman understood that survival was not just about staying alive but about maintaining what made them human. The group's success in developing new survival tactics had attracted attention from other communities, and their warehouse was becoming a training center where representatives from different survivor groups could learn and share innovative approaches to zombie defense. The collaborative effort was creating a network of human resistance that could potentially match the organizational capabilities being demonstrated by the evolved zombies. Knowledge sharing and tactical coordination were becoming as important as weapons and fortifications in the ongoing struggle for survival. Marcus found himself at the center of a growing movement that extended far beyond their small group of survivors, as communities across the region began implementing the defensive strategies and organizational structures they had developed through trial and error. The construction foreman who had reluctantly accepted leadership of a desperate group of refugees was becoming a key figure in the human resistance against an enemy that threatened the very existence of their species. His practical approach to problem-solving and ability to inspire others under pressure made him a natural leader for the broader survival movement. The radio crackled with reports from distant communities, each sharing their own discoveries about zombie evolution and successful countermeasures that had proven effective in their local situations. The collective intelligence of the human survivor network was beginning to match and potentially exceed the organizational capabilities of their undead enemies, creating hope that humanity could not only survive but eventually reclaim their world from the forces that had nearly destroyed it. As the sun set over their temporary sanctuary, Marcus addressed the assembled survivors with words that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed. We've learned that survival isn't just about hiding from our enemies or fighting them when we have no choice. It's about adapting faster than they can evolve, working together more effectively than they can organize, and never losing sight of what makes us human in the first place. The zombies may be getting smarter, but they're still driven by hunger and instinct. We have something they'll never possess: hope, creativity, and the ability to choose our own destiny. The warehouse had become more than a refuge. It was the birthplace of a new chapter in human survival, where ordinary people had learned to overcome extraordinary challenges through cooperation, innovation, and unwavering determination. The battle against the zombie evolution was far from over, but humanity had proven that it possessed the adaptability and resilience necessary to not just survive but ultimately prevail in the struggle for the future of their world.